Let's do a bit of a reprise on 2023. I would say as a non-economist looking back over it, we spent a lot of 2023, it felt like fighting against inflation in the United States, but more broadly. Have we largely put that behind us, do you think, as we go into 2024?
When we last spoke, we noted that in some cases the past is not a great guide to the present, and the last few years have really been outside the data that we're used to seeing, especially in recent history over the post-war period. And 2023 is a great example of that. History was not a good guide to 2023. Some things really were different this time around. At least so far, that inflation unemployment trade-off that people thought would require a severe recession in order to bring inflation down hasn't come to fruition. So the Fed tightened, as we all know, but the economy was very resilient, helped by strong balance sheets that made it less vulnerable to the big increase in rates. But that surprisingly strong demand doesn't bring inflation down. What it did was make room for a supply turnaround. And this is what's unusual relative to the historical record and the models that are calibrated to that data. Good supply chains started to return to normal, worker immigration recovered, labor force participation, especially for those under age 55, really took off and hit a new peak in female labor force participation. So there's some good luck in those numbers, but there is also some inevitability in the sense that we knew that the supply chain effects were not transitory, but they also weren't permanent. And so the end of the pandemic wasn't to return to data as normal, but it started the process of unwinding the pandemic, which gave us supply tailwinds throughout 2023. And that's how you get stronger output without inflation, in fact, a disinflation, and maintained a strong labor market.
So take those two forces, if you would. On the one hand, restrictive monetary policy, which the Fed and other central banks, like the ECB, for example, have really pursued. On the one hand, on the other hand, supply chain reform on the other. And as I look at this, what do they say about the momentum going into 2024? Because on the one hand, you might think, well, these restrictive policies might well really curtail growth going into 2024. But if we really have a supply chain that's reformed, maybe we have prospects of good growth in 2024.
Well, there's momentum coming from the improvements on the supply side. So supply chain is part of it. And the metrics that we have on supply chain have mostly returned to normal. So that's probably not a continuing impulse, but it does sort of free up the economy to continue to expand. The other momentum comes from the labor market, where workers under 55 have really returned in record numbers. Immigration has been very strong. On the demand side, tight monetary policy, remember, has also been balanced by continuing strength in fiscal policy. So the CHIPS Act, the Inflation Reduction Act provided support for investment. And that will probably soften in 2024. So the concern for the adverse momentum is that the long-running increase in rates will finally have more of an impact. Because monetary policy, we know acts slowly, it also acts cumulatively, which we've seen in a number of markets. So that's the concern on the downside, at least in the U.S.
Professor, talking about growth in 2024, for many, many years, the globe has really relied substantially on China to drive growth, economic growth. China has not perhaps come back quite as fast as we thought it would when it released itself from those COVID restrictions. What do you think about China right now and its prospects for growth and helping the world actually in the coming year?
There's two areas that have been the focus so far. One is the property overhang, which has yet to work out, will take some time, and that's a big drag on the economy. There's also a fiscal drag coming from regional and local governments, which have developed a fiscal imbalance over time, which will also be a drag. I think in recovering or managing the shocks, there's a medium or longer run concern, which comes from the increasing centralization and focus of the business economy and the changing business environment, and restrictions that have been put in place. It's always difficult for an economy to transition from catching up and growth into being a global leader that is moving from technological adoption to technological innovation and leadership. So that's always difficult. But having headwinds coming from governance and from institutions will make that even more difficult. So I think a thing to keep an eye on in the medium run is what is the central interaction, the central government interaction with the business community, any restrictions that are put in place, in particular on individuals and on the movement of people and goods and capital.
We talked earlier about supply chains and how the release of the supply chains has helped the United States, the Western European economies, the Western economies, if I could. What about supply chains when it comes to China? Because it appears there's been some reformation of supply chains, maybe pulling back some from China, and maybe going to some places like India or Southeast Asia or even Mexico. As we go into 2024, do you see potential for resurgence and growth in some of those areas?
There's definitely been a movement of some parts of the manufacturing chain into other countries and diversifying that part away from China. But there's been some recent work digging into the data further, and you still see China as a supplier of manufactured goods to those other links in the chain. So it's not as if China has moved out of the supply chain. They just maybe they've moved up and down the supply chain, in particular up the supply chain, and to become suppliers to other manufacturers. So they still play a very important role, which will help their economy, help them to remain stronger. And then you see this diversification moving down the supply chain, which will help other countries in Southeast Asia in particular, but also Mexico, for example.